The most powerful thing Johnny Cash ever did had nothing to do with music. It happened in a conference room in Nashville in 1966, in front of a table full of men in expensive suits who had spent the last 20 minutes explaining to one of the most important artists in American music why he needed to become someone else. The room was quiet when they finished. Cash sat across from them and looked at each of them in turn, the way a man looks at something he has already made up his mind about. And then he said 3 words that ended the meeting, ended the relationship, and started the most important chapter of his career. He said, "That is enough." He stood up, he walked out, and he never looked back. What those 3 words cost him in the short term was considerable. What they gave him in the long term was everything. Because the decision Cash made in that room, the decision to refuse, to walk away, to choose his own truth over someone else's version of commercial viability, was the decision that led directly to Folsom Prison, to the American recordings, to Hurt, to every piece of work in the second half of his career that made him not just a successful musician, but an enduring one. The men in that room thought they were telling him how to survive. What they were actually doing, without knowing it, was giving him the opportunity to find out what he was really made of. This is the story of every time Johnny Cash looked at the people who wanted to control him and said no. It is a story about defiance, but it is not a simple story about defiance, because Cash was not a simple man, and the battles he fought were not simple battles. They were battles about identity, about integrity, about the difference between making music that sells and making music that matters. And the remarkable thing, the thing that makes Cash's story worth telling 50 years after the fact, is that he found a way to do both, but only after he stopped trying to do what other people told him and started doing what he knew was true. To understand why Cash responded to authority the way he did, you have to go back to Kingsland, Arkansas, and to a father who expressed himself through silence and labor rather than warmth or encouragement. Ray Cash was not a cruel man, but he was a hard one, shaped by poverty and loss in ways that left little room for softness. He worked the land because there was no other option, and he expected his children to work it too, without complaint and without the expectation that work would be recognized or rewarded with anything except survival. Cash absorbed that hardness, but he also pushed against it in ways that Ray probably never fully understood. From very early on, Cash had an internal life that was richer and more complex than his circumstances seemed to allow for, a capacity for feeling and for seeing the world in ways that went beyond what the cotton fields and the poverty and the silence of his father's house prepared him for. His mother's gospel music gave him a language for that interior life, a form in which the things that were too large and too true for ordinary speech could be expressed. But it also gave him something else, something more combative, the knowledge that honesty was not just a virtue but a necessity, that music which didn't tell the truth wasn't really music at all, just sound arranged in a pleasing pattern. There was also the simple fact of what it meant to grow up poor in the American South in the 1930s and 1940s, to be the kind of person that the larger world had already decided didn't matter very much. Cash understood from childhood what it felt like to be overlooked, to have your reality ignored by people with more power and more comfort, to be told, implicitly and explicitly, that your experience was not the kind of experience that deserved to be taken seriously. That understanding never left him, and it shaped everything about how he made music and how he responded to the music industry's attempts to manage and direct him. When the Columbia Records executives told him his sound was wrong and his image needed updating, they were in a very real sense repeating something he had been hearing in various forms his entire life, and his response was the same response he had been developing his entire life, a quiet, absolute refusal to accept someone else's definition of what he was worth. The death of his brother Jack in 1944 deepened all of this. Cash was 12 years old when Jack died, and the loss carved something permanent into him, a channel through which everything that followed would eventually flow. Jack had been the person Cash most admired, and losing him taught Cash something about the cost of not being honest while you still have the chance. It taught him that time was not guaranteed, and that the things left unsaid had a way of becoming unbearable. By the time Cash arrived in Memphis in 1954 and found his way to Sun Records, he was already a man with strong opinions about what music was supposed to do and how it was supposed to do it. Sam Phillips recognized this immediately, and what he heard in Cash was a voice that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. The battle started earlier than most people realize. Even at Sun Records, where Phillips gave Cash more creative freedom than most labels of the era would have permitted, there were tensions about direction and commercial viability. Cash's instinct was always toward the darker, more honest material, toward songs that addressed real human experience without softening it or making it palatable. The industry's instinct was always toward whatever had worked before, toward the familiar and the safe and the reliably commercial. Cash navigated those tensions at Sun Records with relative success, partly because Phillips was himself an unconventional thinker who valued originality over formula, and partly because Cash's commercial instincts were good enough that he could often find his way to a song that was both honest and commercially viable. I Walk the Line was the perfect example, a song that was entirely genuine, written from a real place about real feelings, that also happened to be irresistibly catchy and commercially enormous. Cash could do both. The problem was that the industry, having seen him do both, assumed that the commercial part was the point and the honest part was incidental, a stylistic flourish that could be adjusted or replaced if the market demanded it. When Cash moved to Columbia Records in 1958, the scale of the operation changed, and with it the scale of the pressure. Columbia was one of the largest and most powerful labels in the world, and it had very specific ideas about what its artists should sound like and how they should present themselves. Cash was a significant investment, and significant investments were expected to behave in ways that protected their commercial value. The latitude he had enjoyed at Sun Records, the freedom to follow his instincts wherever they led, was considerably narrower at Columbia, and the people responsible for managing his career were not shy about letting him know it. The tensions of the early Columbia years were manageable. Cash was selling records, his career was growing, and the label was willing to tolerate a certain amount of artistic stubbornness from an artist who was generating revenue. But as the 1960s progressed, and Cash's personal life became increasingly chaotic, the amphetamine addiction worsening, the behavior becoming erratic, the commercial performance beginning to reflect the disorder of his private life, the patience of the Columbia executives wore thin. They had invested in Johnny Cash, the commercial proposition, and what they were getting was something considerably more complicated and considerably less predictable. The addiction that defined the worst years of Cash's life was not a secret, but it was something that the people around him in the music industry treated with a kind of willful incomprehension that was itself a form of cruelty. The prevailing attitude was not compassion, but inconvenience. Cash was difficult. Cash was unreliable. Cash was failing to live up to his obligations as a commercial product, and the solution the industry proposed was not treatment or support but the same thing it always proposed: change your image, update your sound, give the audience what they want. Cash had started taking amphetamines in the late 1950s to manage the crushing demands of a touring schedule that kept him on the road for most of every year. The pills did what they were supposed to do at first, keeping him functional when rest was impossible, allowing him to meet the obligations that his success had created. But addiction doesn't stay at the level you set it at. It grows, and it demands more, and what had started as a practical response to an impossible schedule became something much darker and much harder to control. By the mid-1960s, Cash was consuming stimulants and barbiturates in quantities that were genuinely dangerous. His weight had dropped dramatically, his behavior was erratic and sometimes frightening, his marriage to Vivian Liberto was disintegrating under the weight of years of chaos and absence, and the particular kind of damage that addiction does to the people closest to the addict. His professional relationships were strained to the point of rupture, not because the people around him didn't care about him, but because caring about Cash in those years meant accepting a level of unpredictability and unreliability that most professional relationships couldn't sustain. The arrest in El Paso in October 1965, when customs officers found nearly 700 amphetamine tablets in his luggage as he crossed the Mexican border, was the most public and most dramatic moment in a collapse that had been building for years. The headlines were immediate and damaging. The radio stations pulled his songs. The concert promoters canceled bookings. And Columbia Records, which had been absorbing the costs of his increasingly erratic behavior for years, decided that the time for patience had passed. The meeting in Nashville in 1966 was not the first difficult conversation Cash had with Columbia Records executives, but it was the one that mattered most, the one that forced a clarity that all the earlier conversations had managed to avoid. The executives had prepared carefully. They had data, sales figures, chart positions, radio play statistics, audience research. They had a diagnosis. Cash's sound was out of step with the contemporary market. His image was associated with controversy and unreliability, and his commercial trajectory was heading in the wrong direction. And they had a prescription: update the sound, modernize the image, give the audience something shinier and more contemporary than what Cash had been offering. Cash listened to all of it. He was good at listening, better than people expected from a man with his reputation for stubbornness, because listening was how he gathered information, how he understood what he was actually dealing with before he decided what to do about it. He let them finish. He looked at the numbers. He considered briefly and seriously whether they might be right. And then he thought about what they were actually asking him to do, which was not to improve his music or to find new ways to express what he had always expressed, but to become a different kind of artist entirely, to make the kind of smooth and palatable and fundamentally dishonest music that the contemporary market seemed to prefer. He thought about Jack. He thought about his mother singing in the kitchen. He thought about the men in the Folsom Prison audiences he had played for, and the way they responded to his music with a rawness and an intensity that no polished commercial product could ever produce. He thought about what music was for, what it had always been for, what it had been for since before there were record labels and market research and sales projections. And then he stood up. "That is enough," he said. 3 words. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He opened it, and he left. The contract with Columbia Records was terminated in the months that followed. The industry, watching from a safe distance, made the obvious calculation: Cash had burned his bridges, alienated his label, and destroyed whatever commercial momentum he had left. The consensus was that he was finished, that the combination of the addiction and the erratic behavior and the refusal to play by the rules had finally caught up with him. The consensus was wrong. The popular image of defiance is dramatic and loud: a fist raised, a door slammed, a speech delivered to a stunned audience. The reality of Cash's defiance was quieter and more sustained, and ultimately more impressive than any of those images. It was the daily decision, made over and over across decades, to trust his own judgment about what his music should be, even when that judgment put him at odds with the people who controlled his access to the market. After leaving Columbia, Cash did not immediately find a new label or a new commercial direction. He spent time getting sober, getting married to June Carter in March 1968, and thinking seriously about what he actually wanted to do with the second chance he could feel himself being given. He had been given chances before and squandered them, and he was realistic enough about his own history to know that a second chance was not a guarantee of anything. What it was, at best, was an open door. Whether he walked through it and towards something real or towards something safe and calculated was entirely up to him. The answer, when it came, was not a calculated career strategy. It was simpler and more radical than that. He was going to do the thing that felt most true, regardless of whether anyone thought it was commercially viable. He was going to perform at Folsom State Prison, in front of 2,000 men who had been written off by society in the same way he had been written off by the music industry, and he was going to record it exactly as it happened, without fixing any of the rough edges or cleaning up any of the imperfections. He was going to make a record that sounded like reality rather than a product, and he was going to release it and let the world decide what to do with it. The rest of that story is well known. The album became one of the best-selling records of 1968, restored Cash's commercial standing and his critical reputation simultaneously, and opened the door to the Johnny Cash Show on ABC, which ran for 2 years and became one of the most important showcases for American music of its era. It proved, definitively and publicly, that the executives who had told him to change his sound had fundamentally misunderstood what made him valuable. What made him valuable was exactly the thing they had wanted him to get rid of: the honesty, the darkness, the absolute refusal to pretend that life was simpler or prettier or more manageable than it actually was. That was not a liability. It was the entire point. The vindication was real, and Cash understood it as a vindication, but he was also honest enough with himself to know that it could easily have gone the other way. The Folsom gamble could have failed. The album could have sold poorly. The industry could have looked at it as further evidence that Cash was out of step with the times and moved on. The fact that it succeeded was partly a function of the quality of the work, but it was also partly luck, partly timing, partly the particular cultural moment of 1968, when America was in enough turmoil that an unvarnished recording from a state prison felt like exactly the kind of honesty the country needed. Cash had bet on his own judgment and won, but he was clear-eyed enough to know that betting on your own judgment is still a bet, and bets can be lost. It would be satisfying to say that after Folsom, Cash never had to fight those battles again, that having proved his point so conclusively, he was left alone to make whatever music he wanted without interference. But that is not how the music industry works, and it is not what happened. The battles continued, in different forms and at different scales, for the rest of his career. In the 1970s, the battles were about the television show, about which guests Cash could invite and which material he could perform, and how political he was allowed to be on a network television program. Cash had strong views on all of these questions, views that did not always align with what the network wanted, and the resulting tensions were a constant feature of the show's 2-year run. He won some of those battles and lost others, and the show ended in 1971, partly because of those ongoing conflicts. In the 1980s, the battles were about the changing landscape of country music itself, which was moving toward a smoother, more pop-influenced sound that had little room for Cash's particular aesthetic. He was dropped by Columbia Records for a second time in 1986, and his attempt to record for Mercury Records in the late 1980s produced work that satisfied no one, not Cash, not the label, and not the audience. He was, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, genuinely commercially irrelevant, an artist whose moment seemed definitively past, and then Rick Rubin called. The story of Cash's collaboration with Rubin, which began in 1993 and continued until Cash's death in 2003, is in some ways the ultimate vindication of everything Cash had believed about music since he first walked into Sun Records. Rubin's proposition was simple: strip everything away, put Cash in a room with a guitar, and let him sing whatever he wanted. No production conceits, no contemporary references, no attempt to make Cash sound like anything other than exactly what he was. The result was the American Recordings series, which introduced Cash to a generation of listeners who had not been born when he recorded I Walk the Line, and which produced in the Hurt video made in 2002, what many people consider the most powerful piece of music video ever made. The Hurt video is the final and most complete statement of Cash's defiance, not because it is angry or confrontational, but because it is so completely and so devastatingly honest. In it, an old and ill man sits in a decaying mansion and sings a song about pain and regret and the approach of death with a directness that is almost unbearable to watch. There is no performance in it, no attempt to manage the viewer's response or to present Cash in a flattering light. There is only the truth, rendered with the skill and the courage of a man who had spent 50 years learning how to tell it. Trent Reznor, who wrote the song and whose original recording was itself a powerful piece of work, watched the Cash version and said that Cash had taken the song away from him entirely, that it no longer belonged to its original author but to the man who had made it his own by singing it from the center of a lived experience that gave it a weight and a reality that the original could not match. That is what Cash's defiance ultimately produced, not just a career but a body of work that belonged entirely to him, that bore the mark of his particular truth in every note and every word, that could not have been made by anyone else because it required not just talent but the willingness to refuse, over and over again across 50 years, every invitation to be something other than what he was. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, 4 months after June. He was 71 years old, and he was still recording, still making music, still doing the only thing he had ever known how to do when the world became too large or too painful to navigate any other way. The final recordings, released posthumously over the years that followed, carry in them everything that his career had been building toward, the complete and unguarded honesty of a man who had run out of reasons to pretend and had decided, somewhere along the way, that running out of reasons to pretend was not a loss but a liberation. The lesson of Cash's defiance is not that you should always say no to authority, or that commercial success is something to be suspicious of, or that the only authentic art is the art that nobody wants to buy. Cash was too intelligent and too experienced for any of those simple conclusions. He understood the music industry and its requirements. He understood that making records required money, and that money required some degree of commercial viability, and that commercial viability required some degree of compromise. He made those compromises throughout his career in the places where they cost him least. What he refused to compromise was the core of it, the essential quality that made his music his, the particular darkness and honesty and refusal to look away from difficult truths that had been present in his voice since the first time he sang in front of another human being.
the lesson is something more specific and more demanding than a simple anti-authority message. It is that the thing which makes you valuable, the particular quality of your perception, your voice, your way of seeing the world, is exactly the thing that the people who want to manage you will most consistently try to change, not because they are evil or dishonest, but because that thing is also the thing that is hardest to predict, and hardest to package, and hardest to sell in the way that commercial enterprises need to sell things. The music industry wanted Cash to be easier. His darkness and his honesty made him harder, and the degree to which he was willing to protect that difficulty, to refuse to sand it down into something more palatable, is the degree to which his work has lasted, while the smoother, safer, more commercially optimized music of his era has mostly been forgotten. He walked out of that Nashville conference room in 1966, and he never stopped walking, never stopped moving toward the music that felt true, regardless of what it cost him commercially or professionally. He walked into Folsom Prison. He walked into Folsom Prison. He walked into Rick Rubin's studio at 61 years old and sat down with a guitar and sang as if nobody was listening and everyone was listening at the same time. He walked through the last 4 months of his life, making recordings that had no commercial purpose whatsoever, that existed only because he needed to make them, because making music was how he processed the world, and the world had given him, at the end, more than he knew how to process any other way. Cash stood up in that conference room and said 3 words, "That is enough." And in saying them, he was not just ending a meeting or rejecting a contract. He was stating, clearly and finally and without any room for misunderstanding, what he believed music was for and what he was willing to do to protect it. He was right. The proof is in everything that came after, in the albums and the concerts, and the final recordings, and the voice that is still, 20 years after his death, the most honest voice in American music,